up everyone, welcome back to another episode of AWS tutorial. And today I'm going to show you how to build a Java Spring Boot API using Hibernate and a MySQL database in the backend. And then we're going to host everything on AWS. So for the Spring Boot API, we're going to divide that into three pieces or three layers. The first layer is going to be the controller layer that handles all the user requests from the client. And then we're going to have a service layer that deals with all the business logics. And then finally, we're going to have the DAO layer that communicates with our database and then send the response back to the clients. And this tutorial is going to be a two-part series. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how to build out the API from scratch, step by step, and then test it with a MySQL database in our local machine. And then in part 2 of the tutorial, I'm going to configure and deploy everything to AWS. I'm going to include a link down below when it's available, so you can check that out as well. So without further ado, let's get to today's topic. Okay, so step 1 of the process is to create a skeleton Spring Boot project. And there are many ways to do it, but what I normally do is to just use the Spring Initializr to create a skeleton. So you can just go to this website and then enter the information that you want. So I'm going to choose Maven and then Java, obviously. And then what I normally do, I just choose the latest version, that is the stable version. In our case, is 2.62. And then enter this information. For me, I'm just going to do Gmeister, and then I just do tutorial. But you can enter your information the way you want it. And then package, I choose jar. And then for the Java version, I just choose Java 8 because that's the most common version that's being used in the industry. And then before we go, we need to add some dependencies to it. The first one is Spring Web because we need to use that to expose our endpoints. And then the next one is MySQL driver, because we're going to use a MySQL database. And then we're going to add Spring Data JPA. That's what we're going to use to communicate with our database. And then lastly, we're going to add Lombok. And that's what we're going to use to define our setters and getters. And that's everything. And then we're going to click on Generate to generate our package. And then choose the directory that you want to save it to. And you should get a zip folder within a few seconds. And I'm going to open that. And it seems like everything is there. And now we're going to use IntelliJ to import this. But you can use other IDEs if you want to. But IntelliJ is my go-to for Java applications. So I'm going to open IntelliJ. And then select the Open or Import option. And then choose the project that you just downloaded and unzip. And then hit open. I think it's going to take a minute to resolve all the dependencies. Okay, so it seems like it's done processing. And we got everything imported here in a nice structure. So the first thing we're going to do here is within our tutorial package, we're going to create a few more packages here to represent what we have in the architecture diagram. So the first one is going to be the controller package. And then the second one is going to be the service package. And then the third one is the DAO package. I'm just going to call it repository, but you can call it DAO if you want to. And then lastly, we're going to have a model package that is going to host our class that's going to represent our data entity. So let's start from our models. So within here, we're going to create a new class called product. So before we go on, I want to point out one thing here. So remember when we added dependencies to the project, we added Lombok for the getters and setters. So if you're using IntelliJ, you have to add that as a plugin as well in order for that to recognize. So the way to do it is click on IntelliJ, Preferences. Under Plugins, you're going to search Lombok and you just click Installed. I already have it installed, so I don't need to do it again. If you don't do that, it's not going to recognize the Lombok annotations, so that's very important. So for this one, the first thing first, we're going to add a entity annotation here to make sure that our project knows this is our entity class. And then specify the table name. And the table that we're going to create in our MySQL database later on, I think we're just going to call it product underscore inventory. And then we're going to add the data annotation here. That is a Lombok annotation to let the application know that we're going to have the default getter and setters so that we don't have to define them explicitly. That saves a lot of work. And now let's define some attributes. So the first thing is an ID that we're going to use. We're going to use long for that, which is our product ID, which is also the primary key for our database table. And then the next one is a string. Let's say that is product name. The next one is, let's say, color. We want to know what the color is for the product. And then the last one, let's say the price for the product. And for the first one, since it's an ID, so we need to add the ID in notation here. And then for the generated value, we are just going to say, define a strategy as identity, because that's the primary key. And then for the second one, we're going to add a column attribute to it. It's going to have the name. We're going to define that as a product name, product underscore name. And then we don't want it to be nullable because we want the product to have a name always. And then the column name for this one will be the same as color. And then lastly, price. We're just going to name it price as well. So that is our entity class. And now let's move on to the controller. We are going to have two controllers. The first one is going to be health controller. That's going to handle the health check. And then we're going to have a product controller that handles all the requests that we have regarding our database for the product inventory. So for the health class, it's going to be really simple. We're just going to have one method here that is going to respond a 200 back to the user if the app is up and running. So I'm going to do response entity. Since it doesn't have anything, I'm just going to put a question mark there. And then what it returns is just a new entity status that okay. Fix the import here. Okay, and then we're going to add the annotation of a get mapping. Let's just do health. And that is everything we need to do for the health controller. And next, we're going to define what we're going to do for the product controller. So let's put some comments here to tell what we're going to do here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to insert a product into our database. And then we want to get a single product by its ID. And then we're going to do a get all the products in our table. And then we're going to define a endpoint for updating an existing item in our database. And then we're going to define an endpoint for deleting an item in our database. And then lastly, we are going to define an endpoint that we can use raw SQL statements for getting an item or do whatever you want. Because all these operations has a built-in method to get what you want to do here, but I also want to show you how to do it with a raw SQL custom statement to get data from our database. I think that's very helpful. So let's say that we want to get an item from our database by its product name using a raw SQL statement. And we're going to define all these endpoints later on. The next element in our flow is the service flow, because the controller, if you remember, the controller is going to call the service. So in our service package, we are going to define a class called product service that handles all the business logic. And then in our repository, or in our DAO layer, we are going to have a product repository here to communicate with our database. And that is going to be an interface. We're just going to call it product repository. The product repository is going to be pretty simple. We are going to have that extend a class called JPA repository. And our entity class is going to be product. Let me fix the import. And the primary key is going to be long. Because remember, in our product, we defined that this is a long. If you want to do integer, that's going to be integer in here. So this is like 90% what we need to do for the repository class. And now let's go back to the controller and define our detailed endpoints. So let's go back to product controller. So first thing first, we are going to inject our product service because that's going to be used by all the endpoints here. So let's say product service. and we're gonna do an auto wire here, just so that it knows to inject an object here. And in our product service, so since it's gonna use the DAO layer to communicate with our database, we're gonna do an injection here as well. Okay, so now let's define our endpoint. So the first one is the post method that we want to insert an item to our database. So I'm going to define that as a public method, and it's going to respond a response entity. Let's say just do products. Let's call it save products, and we're going to pass in the product object as a request body. So let's do post mapping products, and this needs to be request body. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use the product service that we have injected here. We're going to do save products product. We're going to define this method later, don't worry about it. And then it's going to return a new response entity with a HTTP status of create. And now let's define this method in our product service. So all we need to do here is public, return type is product, and then save product. And what we need to do here is pretty simple. We are just gonna use the product repository and use its built-in function called save our product. And that's it. We don't need to do anything with the product repository class. And now let's go back here, and the red underline should be gone. And now move on to the next one, which is to get a single object from our database by its ID. So what we're going to do here is to define a public method. We just call it get products, and we're going to pass in the product ID as a query parameter. So this is going to be a get mapping. Let's call it products, and we're going to do request param with the name of product ID. And what we're going to do here is the same thing. We're going to use the product service to get the products by the product ID, and we're going to define that method later and do something similar here to return a new response entity and HTTP status OK. That is just a 200. And now let's copy this, and we're going to define it here. And the same thing here, we're going to use the product repository to help us to communicate with our database to get the product by the ID. So I'm going to do return product repository find by ID. This is also a built-in method. And then we're going to pass in the ID. One thing that I want to mention here is whatever the user pass in, we may not have that item in our database. So in that way, we're just going to throw a exception. And I'm going to define that as a lambda function here. I'm just going to return a runtime exception if it's not found, but you can define your custom exception if you want. And that is it for the get method. And that should be gone. And next, we're going to get all the products. And we're going to return that as a list of products. We just call it get products, and it doesn't take in anything. And the same thing, we're going to return, or we're going to use the product service to do the work for us. And we're going to define this method. And then same thing, we're going to use the product repository. And next, we're going to do a update on our item. Oh, I forgot to add a get mapping here. And this is going to be products. And it's going to take in the product ID and what we want to update the product to. So that's going to be coming from the request body. So this is going to be a patch mapping. And this is going to be coming from the query parameter with the name of product ID. And that is going to be coming from our request body. Okay. And now let's define this method. Okay, so the first thing we need to do here is we need to retrieve the existing item by the product ID, and then we're going to modify it. So what we're going to do here is the same thing. We're going to use the product repository to find it. And we're going to do the same thing here. If it doesn't exist, we're just going to throw an error, because if it's not there, we're not going to be able to update it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the product name to be what the user is passing in. And then we're going to set the color. So one thing you may notice is here that it has the getter and setter out of the box here, but then we did not define any getter setters here. It's because we have the add data annotation here from the lombok. So that's very convenient. So what we're going to do next is we're going to use the product repository to save our product. And then return. And now we're going to define the delete endpoint. And that is going to take in a product ID that we want to delete item for. And then lastly, we are going to do a get product by name using a raw SQL statement. You can also use the default method, but I think it's helpful to show how to use your custom SQL statement to do queries on your database as well. So that's going to be returning a list of product, because it's possible that multiple products have the same name. And that is going to be a get method as well. Let's just call it products by name, and we're getting that from our query parameter that is called product name, and we're going to return a list of items by name, product name, and we're going to copy this and define it here. And we are also using the product repository to do it for us. And you may notice that there's no such a method like we do for all others. So what we're going to do is we're going to define this in the product repository class. So I'm going to copy this, go to the product repository class. So since this is a interface, we don't need to specify the access identifier. So it's going to return a list of products back to the user, and it's going to call. And how we're going to do it is we're going to add a query annotation, and then inside we're going to have a value tag here where we can specify our SQL statement. We're going to do select everything from our product inventory class, where the product name is equal to the first argument of our method. And then we need to specify that native query is equal to true. So what it means is that it's gonna select everything, like all the attributes like ID, price, product name, and the color from our product inventory, where the product name is equal to the product name that we pass in, and that is the syntax for it. Okay, and that should resolve the error. And here as well. Okay, so that's everything for the coding part of the API, and now I think we are ready to test everything using a MySQL database in our local machine. But before we can do that, we need to specify the database name and the table name in our Java Spring Boot application. And we are doing that in the application properties file under resources. So let me open that. So the first thing that we need to add is the database or the data source URL that we're going to use. And that is a Spring property. And that is JDBC by using a MySQL database. And since we're testing it locally, so we're going to do localhost, and our port is 3306. And then our database name, let's just call it store database or something like that, because we are dealing with products. And this one is pretty important. We're not going to use SSL. We're going to use parameters instead. So our username and password for our database. And we're going to define our database username here. And we're going to set the password as well. And this is going to be your password that you set up when you set up your MySQL database. So you need to change that. I think we have a typo here. Okay, so that should be everything. And now we're ready to move on to create our database in MySQL. And then we're going to test everything, all the endpoints here. Okay, so before we can create a database in our MySQL local server, there are two things we need to install in our local machine. So the first one is the MySQL local server, of course. And you can go to this website to download that for your specific system. And then the next thing that we need is the MySQL Workbench. That is a UI that we use to interact with our SQL server on our local machine. And then after you have those two download, you need to start your MySQL server. And for Windows users, I think this is what you need to follow. And for Mac users, this is all you need to do to start your local server. And then you can open up your Workbench so that you can interact with your MySQL database or server. But you can Google all those things by yourself. It's pretty straightforward. And I already have mine started up, and I have my Workbench opened up. And now I don't have any database created yet. So remember, back in our application, we say that we're going to create a database called store data. So we're going to do that here using the Workbench. So under query, I'm just going to do create database and then hit this button here. And it's successful. And if we hit refresh here, we should be able to see a database. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a table. Remember, we say that we're going to create a table called product inventory. So we're going to do it here. So we need to do that. Let's comment this out. And then we're going to do this. So what it means is that we're going to create a table if it doesn't exist in our database yet. That is called product inventory. And then we're going to define all the fields that we need. So the first one is the ID field. We have a big integer type and it cannot be null, which is a primary key, and we're just going to use auto increment as our strategy. And then we're going to have a product name that is a varchar, cannot be null, and then color as a varchar as well, and then the price as an integer. So hit send, and it's successful. And if we do a refresh, and we should be able to see a table here called product inventory. Let's just make sure that it's empty before we do any operations on it. So select everything from product inventory. All right, so it doesn't have anything there. So now let's go back to our IntelliJ and then go to our main method. And you can see a triangle button here. You can just click and then to run main. And it's going to build and run it locally. And you can see that it started up successfully here. And now let's open Postman to test all our endpoints. So I'm going to open Postman and then hit the plus sign. So it's going to be HTTP localhost 8080. That's the default port. And let's do the health check first to make sure that it's healthy. So I'm going to do /health, hit send. We got a 404. Let's see what happened. This is what happened. We forgot to add the annotation of REST controller here. And the same thing for product as well. Okay, let's restart it. Alright, we got an error in that area. Product service cannot be fine. I think we forgot to add another annotation here as well. Service. And that should be good now. Let's start it. Okay, so it's working now. Let's go back to Postman. Hit the health check. It's 200, so it's working. And now let's test out our real endpoint in our product controller. So the first one, let's say that we want to create a product and insert that into our database. So it's going to be post, and that's going to be product. And in our request body, I believe we say that we need product name. Let's say just do product A. And let's say what other attributes we need. Color. Let's do green. And then price. Let's do 100. And you don't need to pass in the ID because it's going to be auto-generated by the MySQL database. So let's hit send. Okay, so it's 201, created successfully. And now let's go back to our MySQL workbench. And we're going to execute this to see what we have in our database. And as you can see, we created one product here called product A. And now let's create a couple more. And now if I go back and hit the refresh button, I should see 3 items here. And yep, that is working. And now let's test out the get product by the product ID. So it's a get method. And we're gonna pass in a product ID, let's say 2. It should return us the second item in our database. Yep, and that is right. If we do 3, it's gonna return the third item, and that is correct. And let's say that we want to do products, and we don't need that. And it should return a list of items from our database. Yep, and it's 1, 2, 3, 3 items. And let's say right now we want to update the second item or the third item, and it's gonna use a patch method, and that will take in a product ID. Let's say that we want to update the second one, and that is gonna update the second item to be this. Alright, so it's successful. And if we go back to the workbench, and the second item should be updated. And yep, that is right. And then delete method. Let's say that we want to delete the first item, and it's gonna take in the product ID. And we don't need this. Let's say that the first one, and it's gonna be a delete. Hit send. And if I go back here, and the first one is gone. And now, lastly, let's test out products by name. It's a get method, and we use our custom SQL statement there. And I think, say product name, right? Yep, product name. And let's say that we want to get product C. Product C, it should return just one item. That's an error. Oh, still it should be get. Yep, and it returns a list of items that has product name equal to product C. And seems like everything's working. So this is it for part 1, everyone. And in part 2 of the tutorial, we're gonna deploy everything into AWS and we're gonna test it again. And I hope you have learned something. And if you like this video, I hope you can give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.